just 251 millimeters squared. Whereas Vega 64 featured 64 compute units and Vega 56 compute units, the RX 5700 gets 36 units and the 5700 XT gets 40. However, this is somewhat of a meaningless comparison as the cores featured in the Navi GPUs are quite a bit different to those
Jiggle,
in
do you know a
Vega-based
good
GPUs.
level 80 recipe to use as a trial to see if my gear's enough to do the rest?
You can definitely do it. Just maybe
Yeah,
HQ.
it shouldn't be too big of a deal. I have a macro that
level-
I've been using. I have to check out the dungeon though.
Well, I mean, I was only Alamegan. I wasn't the BIS before, so I was one gear set back on my crafters.
Don't hit the wall, Peanut. Lines, come to the front, please, if there's too much, not enough room back there. God. Do you need gear? Like, are you 80?
On my crafters,
Yeah.
I just made it today, so
Oh, nice. If you want to gather the mats, I can craft it for you, the new stuff.
I'd like to try it and see if I had to do a intermediate gear set, maybe I'll ask. But if I can go from
also-
mine to the next.
Yeah, they didn't make it very difficult. Oh my god, what did I do? Oh, that's right.
Oh yeah, the first pull of the twinning is single tour, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
20. Oh god, they're gonna hit it. I'm moving over. Oh, thank god. I think if you can make the level 79 mats, you should be good to go.
Okay. Yeah, those
Because
I think
the
were all
fact
easy.
The fact that HQ now goes up to the 75%
Yeah, it makes it a
really
lot easier.
ridiculous. Yeah. Oh my god. What did I do?
Great, now the casting stuff drops.
Rip.
It's okay, my retainer will need it.
I don't know, you like get the chest.
The gathering requirements to just make a crafting set is a lot lower than I thought.
Yeah.
Not a lot of mats. Very kind of them.
It's the reset patch.
Still, I was expecting a lot more than only 112 Dwarven Cotton and 36 Sea Swallow. That's it. For a, left side, no main hand offhands, just the shared gear.
It's all leatherworking stuff in there.
Half leather, half weaver.
Yeah, cool. You don't need like, 300 Hellguy main or something ridiculous.
No, exactly. I hated that.
Set. Go.
of course they threw in those 2 wildfowl feathers just to be a jerk.
Oh. I don't know what this guy's doing. He's kind of just standing around. He's casting Aspect of Benefic. Why?
Peak single precision performance of the 5700 XT is down 23% on Vega 64, but the pixel fill rate has been increased by 23%, and that's what will make the 5700 XT a better gaming GPU. AMD's also done away with HBM for these parts, and instead they're using 8GB of GDDR6 memory for a bandwidth of 448GB per second, using a 256-bit wide memory bus. So the same peak memory bandwidth as the new 2060 Super and 2070 Super. Initially, the 5700 XT was set to cost $450 US, but last minute AMD revealed a surprising price cut that saw the 5700 XT dropped by $50, making it a $400 part. Meanwhile, the 5700 was reduced by $30, taking it from $380 US down to $350 US. So the price cut was unexpected, but it is very exciting as it should make these parts very, very competitive in terms of cost per frame. AMD's claiming a 225 watt board power rating
Do
for the
the level
5700
80
XT
Crystarium
and
deliveries
185
give
watts for the
white script or only
5700.
yellow?
And these ratings
Only
are
yellow.
quite a bit lower than the equivalent Vega 10 parts. As for clock speeds, they can be a little misleading, though at least AMD has specified the gaming clock. The boost clock is virtually meaningless as this frequency isn't achieved beyond the first few seconds of gaming. Thankfully though, the gaming clock is accurate and we generally saw clock speeds around 50 MHz higher than what AMD were claiming, but then we are only testing in a 21 degree environment, so that could change for those of you in hotter rooms. Though we suspect the fan speed would just ramp up to maintain those clock speeds. Oh, and just lastly, they do support PCIe 4.0, which is nice and all that, but for these particular GPUs in today's games, it offers no performance improvements over 3.0. Anyway, that's enough looking at the specs. Let's just get on with it. So quickly, we'll just go over the test system specs and then, of course, jump into the blue bar graphs. For testing, I've used the Intel Core i9 9900K clocked at 5 GHz with 32 GB of DDR4 3400 memory. The latest drivers available at the time of testing have been used, and all this data is fresh, brand new for this video and collected in the past 2 weeks. We have 12 games to look at before the usual performance breakdowns and cost per frame data. I'll be focusing on 1440p performance, but for all the 1080p and 4K results, please head over to our Patreon page. The link's in the video description. You'll be able to get them all there for free. Okay, let's get into the results. First up, we have Battlefield 5, and right away we have some strange looking results. The new Radeon RX 5700 XT is extremely impressive, rendering 112 FPS on average. But what's strange here is the unusually low 1% low performance. Whereas the 5700 XT is 11% faster than the RTX 2070 Super for the average frame rate. It was just 1% faster for the 1% low result. I'm not really sure if this is an issue that AMD will be able to address with a future driver, but at least I can confirm the gameplay was still very smooth with no noticeable stuttering. We see the same thing with the standard 5700 as well. Although it was able to match the average frame rate of the 2070 Super, the 1% low result was well below that of the 2060 Super. Again, overall performance was good, but I'm just not quite sure what's going on here. I suspect this is a driver issue, as we never saw these unexplainably low 1% low results in any other game tested. Frame rates in Rainbow Six Siege, for example, were very consistent. That said though, the RX 5700 XT did fall well short of the 2070 Super. Still, it did deliver RX 2070-like performance and was just 5% slower than the Radeon 7. The 5700, on the other hand, well, I think that was a bit more impressive. It fell just 9% behind the 2060 Super, though I am hoping we see more favourable results for AMD in the other games tested. Unfortunately, that's not the case with Metro Exodus. Here the margins are quite similar to what we just saw. Here the 5700 XT trailed the 2070 Super by an 11% margin, though this time the 5700 was just 6% slower than the 2060 Super. The Radeon 7 was also 17% faster than the 5700 XT, though of course it is a much more expensive product. Moving on to Resident Evil 2, and we see fairly competitive results here. The 5700 XT was just 5% slower than the 2070 Super, while the 5700 was 4% slower than the 2060 Super. So, although Nvidia does enjoy a performance advantage in this title, their competing products also cost more, so it'll be interesting to see how they compare in a cost per frame analysis at the end of the video. Next up we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and here the 5700 and 2600 Super are neck and neck. Just a frame in it here, which is within the margin of error. The 5700 XT didn't do too poorly, but it was 7% slower than the 2070 Super, but it also cost 10% less, so we're probably looking at a break-even scenario here. Both of the new RX 5700 graphics cards were able to deliver highly playable performance in Fortnite at 1440p using the maximum image quality settings, but as I've said in the past, it isn't a good title for AMD when comparing performance with the GeForce competition. The 5700 XT only managed to match the 2060 Super, which obviously isn't a great result overall. Moving on, we find a much stronger result for AMD in the Division 2. Granted, they don't exactly brush aside the GeForce competition, but even so, the 5700 matched the 2060 Super, while the 5700 XT was just 7% slower than the 2070 Super, so not a bad result overall. Here we see a really good result for the new RDNA GPUs. The 5700 just edged out the 2060 Super, though really this one is a tie, and the same is true when comparing the 5700 XT and 2070 Super. Still, this is a highly competitive result for the new AMD GPUs. I'm betting AMD wish every title was as kind to them as Forza Horizon 4, because what a shellacking we have here. The standard 5700 easily beats the 2070 Super, leaving the 2060 Super behind in a completely different performance tier. Meanwhile, the 5700 XT managed to beat even the Radeon 7, spitting out an incredible 131 FPS on average, basically placing it on par with the RTX 2080 Ti. Although not nearly as amazing, the Far Cry New Dawn results are still favourable for AMD, as both 5700 GPUs edged out, or at the very least, matched the GeForce competition. Given they both cost a bit less, this is a very solid result for AMD. Another stellar result for AMD can be seen when testing with World War Z. Here the 5700 and 5700 XT easily beat their nearest competitors. The 5700 XT even beat the RTX 2080. The standard 5700 was 13% faster than the 2060 Super, though it did only manage to just edge out Vega 56. The last game tested is Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and here the 5700 XT was just 7% slower than the 2070 Super, while the 5700 was 13% slower than the 2060 Super. So not a great
chat.
result, but not too disappointing to end on either. So with all the FPS performance now in the bag for a dozen games, let's move
Yeah,
on
get
to
hit by.
check out power consumption.
Probably one of the beams.
Here we're looking at just GPU power consumption, so not the entire graphics card, not board consumption, just the power consumed by the GPU. Interestingly, the 5700 XT consumes 6% less power than the RTX 2070 Super and 25% less than the Radeon 7. The standard 5700 consumed 27% less power than the XT model, and that meant it was
Oh,
much
what?
more
That
efficient
hit me.
than even
Wow.
the RTX
That's sad.
2060. So a tremendous result for the base model RX 5700. Now, when looking at total system consumption, we do see a few changes. Now the 5700 XT consumes slightly more power than the 2070 Super, which is interesting. It's not a big change, but whereas it consumed 6% less power in the GPU only test, now when measuring the entire board plus the system, it consumed 2.5% more power. And then we see the 5700 is now matching the standard 2060, whereas previously it did consume noticeably less power. Before wrapping up the testing, let's have a quick look at the stock and overclock temperatures along with the clock speeds and fan speeds. Out of the box, the 5700 XT ran at 84 degrees and maintained a core clock speed of 1740 MHz and a memory speed of 872 MHz,
Guess I
which is
should go
basically
cook
14 gigabits per
then.
second.
See you later.
The blower fan typically spun at
Okay,
1200 RPM, and here
Hi.
it wasn't too loud. Now, moving on to overclocking for the 5700 XT, we saw a peak core clock speed of
I'm so tired of
1940
this
MHz,
75 dungeon.
but at times
Oh
it
my
would still
god.
drop as low as 1720 MHz, and on
I don't know
average
how
we
you could
saw
keep
a
running
speed of
dungeons
about
all day. It's
1860
crazy.
MHz, which is about a 10% overclock. The massive
Badass.
fluctuation was due to
Mindless
an almost
dungeons.
90 degree operating temperature. At 88 degrees, the GPU tends to throttle, and with the fan running at 43%,
I want my
2100
robot.
RPM, there was the potential to improve
clean.
cooling performance. As for the memory,
What
I was
robot?
only able to get the GDDR6
Machinist
memory up to a
Machinist.
transfer speed
Oh,
of
my
14.3
walking robot.
gigabits per second, so that was a bit disappointing.
70.
With the core clock speed jumping all over the place, I decided to crank up the fan to 100%, where it's incredibly noisy as it spun at 4600 RPM. But the benefit of doing this is it drops the GPU temperature to just 70 degrees, and now the 5700 XT was able to maintain a core clock speed of over 2 GHz at all times. So that's about a 20% overclock from stock. So I reckon liquid cooling is going to be a pretty popular
Hey,
option for
Estrel.
these 5700 XT graphics cards.
Yes.
As for the
You
standard
have
5700, out of the box about 75
armor
degrees with a fan speed of
decent?
1900 RPM,
I
and
have
it maintained
armor
a typical
decent, yes.
operating frequency of
Whatever.
1670 MHz. Then when
Let me
overclocked
see.
with an
Armor
auto fan
is
speed, it hit
at
85 degrees.
323, so
But
not
the
quite
fans were only
into
spinning
the
at 1600
yet.
RPM, and apparently
Okay.
this
In
is
that
a
annoying
bug
spot.
with the reviewer driver that will be addressed with the public driver that you'll now have access
Yeah, I'm
to.
having
That
a
being
hard
the
time
case, for
getting
one
Armor
last
and
test, I
Weaver
cranked
from
up the fan
330
speed to
to
50% manually, which saw the
360-ish.
blower fan spin at 2700 RPM, and this
Oh,
was
I
quite
think
loud.
you're, like,
Nothing
about the
crazy
same
or unbearable,
part
but
as my
certainly
alt then.
noticeable. But
Yeah,
it did allow
basically
the
the
5700 to average a core
easiest
frequency of
stuff is
1700
dropped from the
MHz
24
at just 70 degrees.
raids.
Unfortunately,
which
I
is
wasn't able to push the
annoying to
core any
have to
higher
farm.
as there appears to be some sort of
I
frequency
think I can
cap,
go up
and I'm
to the
not sure if AMD
360
will remove
stuff
this
if I
or
meld
if it's
it
something that we have
doubly,
to deal with.
but I haven't been
Okay,
doing that.
so
I
there's
guess I
all
should
the
just use up
performance
a lot of my primary
information.
stat
It was
meld that
certainly
way.
very back and forth, so I'm keen to see how they stacked
Well,
up
if you
over the
meld,
dozen games
it's higher
tested.
decent.
And then, of course, we
If
have
you-
a few performance
I think
breakdown
each meld you
charts,
put in is
and
like
then
a
we'll
5
get
to
to the cost
7%
per
increase
frame
for
data.
the
I
So
PC.
didn't know
let's go
that.
do all that. First up, we have the battle between the 5700 and its main competitor, the RTX 2060 Super. From our 12-game sample, the 5700 was on average 1% faster, and a massive win in Forza Horizon 4 really helped the Radeon GPU pull off that win. That said, if we remove the Forza result, which some will claim as an outlier, the 5700 is just 2% slower on average. Either way, it's close enough to call a tie, and I generally do this when discussing margins that are less than 5%. We also saw highly competitive performance in Dirt Rally 2, Far Cry New Dawn, The Division 2, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and even Resident Evil 2. So it'll be interesting to see how these two stack up when it comes to the cost per frame comparison. When compared to the RTX 2070, the 5700 was just 2% slower on average. Again, it did enjoy a massive win in Forza Horizon 4, but even so, it pulled off solid wins in World War Z and Battlefield 5 as well. Then, when compared to Vega 56, the 5700 was 11% faster on average. Not a massive performance uplift after 2 years, but the 5700 is significantly less complex, so AMD should be able to turn a profit on this one, even at $350. So, there's that. Next up, we have the 5700 XT, and it also does well in its battle with the RTX 2070 Super. Here it was just 2% slower on average, and even if we remove the Forza result, it's still just 4% slower. So again, within that 5% margin that I usually declare a tie. The 5700 XT was also just 9% slower than the much more expensive RTX 2080, so you can see why Nvidia feels the need to introduce the 2080 Super. At times, the Radeon GPU was up to 20 to 24% slower, but that still makes the 5700 XT a much better value option, as you'll see in a moment. Speaking of value, the 5700 XT, like the 2070 Super, not only eliminates the standard 2080, but it also waves goodbye to the compute-heavy Radeon 7. Here we see it's just 6% slower, so I hope you didn't just recently drop around $700 US on a Radeon 7 just for gaming. Alright, so time to check out just how much value these new Radeon graphics cards offer at these suggested prices. Here we have an MSRP comparison that compares launch prices, and compared to Vega 56's $400 US MSRP, the 5700 XT offers a massive 21% discount per frame, while the standard 5700 provides a 22% discount, so that's nice. It's also a massive improvement over the Radeon 7, and we only got that 5 months ago at a cost of $6.54 per frame, and we see that the 5700 XT saves you almost 40%, as you're basically getting the same performance for $300 off. But I won't pretend like the Radeon 7 or RTX 2080 were ever particularly good value, so let's just move on to a comparison with the current market prices. Even here, the 5700 and 5700 XT look very nice at their MSRPs. Incredibly, both are more cost effective than the 2060 Super and standard 2060, as well as the GTX 1660 Ti. The 5700 comes in at a rather large 14% discount per frame when compared to the 2060 Super, and the 5700 XT, well, that's 18% cheaper per frame when compared to the 2070 Super. So that actually looks really good for these new Radeon GPUs. In fact, even before the last minute price cut, AMD had beaten Nvidia in terms of cost per frame, and I suppose they knew it, but despite that, they cut prices further. Okay, so time to wrap this review up. Last week I wasn't super excited regarding Nvidia's refresh. The 2060 Super, it just kind of slotted into the existing pricing structure that was set a year ago. The 2070 Super, on the other hand, that was decent. It was a nice little upgrade at the $500 price point. Of course, the entire point of those new GPUs was to disrupt AMD's Navi release, and while it certainly did put a damper on this review initially, AMD's late move to adjust pricing once again has sparked a lot of excitement around the 5700 and 5700 XT. In terms of performance, the RX 5700 looks to deliver 2060 Super-like performance, which is RTX 2070-like performance, and that makes it slightly faster than Vega 64. So priced at $350 US, it's an exceptionally good value option. Then we have the RX 5700 XT, which finds itself in a bit of a sweet spot at $400 US, coming out at a cost of just $4 per frame in our tests, making it better value than the cheaper products such as the original 2060 and 1660 Ti. Not to mention you're getting 2070 Super-like performance at a rather hefty discount. So this all means if AMD is able to stock shelves with $400 5700 XTs and $350 5700s, then they will have by far the best offerings at these price points. In fact, for anyone spending $700 or less, the 5700 XT is now the new go-to option, at least until the 2080 Super arrives later this month. At that point, the 5700 XT may only be the go-to option when spending $500 or less. The success of these new Navi GPUs really depends on pricing and availability, but so far things are looking good for AMD. I've also been told that custom AIB models are on the way, and if they can boost out-of-the-box performance even a little bit while bringing about the typical AIB card advantages, then Nvidia might be forced into making a few pricing adjustments of their own, and at that point, we'll have a good old-fashioned GPU pricing war on our hands. I kept telling you guys, as soon as AMD becomes even remotely competitive in the mid-range to high-end market, it's on. And right now, it's looking very much to be on. I'm keen to see how Nvidia responds. AIB models aside, the good news here being that these cards are relatively quiet and nothing like the Radeon 7. The fans on the 5700 XT spun at only 2100 RPM after an hour-long stress test, while the GPU was sitting at a little over 80 degrees. That's perfectly fine. It's a blower style cooler, so it's not exactly ideal, but it's certainly usable and it won't require any earmuffs. Again, I'm looking at you, Radeon 7. In summary, I have to say I am a bit blown away by what AMD's offering at these price points, and I'm very surprised they're as competitive as they are. I wasn't nearly as impressed with the original pricing, despite the fact that it still positioned the 5700 series ahead of Nvidia's super products in terms of value. They were only just ahead, but like I said, I wasn't that impressed with super, so just beating Nvidia in terms of value, it would have been a lot less exciting. I just hope a few weeks from now, stock levels are good and pricing is very close to the MSRP. Based on what we've seen in the past from AMD, it seems like a long shot, but let's remain positive and yeah, hope that happens. Anyway, no matter what I say, it's really going to. Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Finally, it is time to review AMD's new 3rd generation Ryzen processors. And on hand, we have the Ryzen 9 3900X and the Ryzen 7 3700X. Unfortunately, these are the only two CPUs AMD has sent out to reviewers. So the Ryzen 5 processors and the 3800X, well, yeah, who knows how they perform. We'll know shortly. AMD will be sampling them at a later date, but we've just gone out and purchased them. So anyway, at least we've got these two. It's certainly a lot better than nothing. And AMD, in their infinite wisdom, also decided to lift the review embargo for both Zen 2 and Navi reviews at the same time. But we're going to delay our Navi review for a little bit, just so you guys can get the Zen 2 stuff and the videos aren't tripping over each other, because we know the YouTube algorithm doesn't particularly like that. And rather than do one video that summarizes both Zen 2 and Navi, we thought we'd just give you all the juicy details on Zen 2 first. But why AMD didn't choose to dominate the news cycle for a few weeks is beyond me, but maybe that's why I don't get paid the big bucks. Anyway, that's just about enough whinging from me. We have a boatload of information to go over, and since I know most of you really just want to see the benchmark results, I'm not going to spend too much time going over specs and pricing. But before we get into anything, today's video sponsor is NordVPN, and right now they're offering Hardware Unboxed viewers 75% off a 3-year membership when you use the link in the video description. And that works out to be just $2.99 per month, which in my opinion is a very small price to pay for your internet security, allowing you to browse, download, and shop safely. Hardware Unboxed gets bombarded with advertising opportunities from VPN services, and to date NordVPN is the only company we've worked with, and that's for good reason. It's the only service we use and trust. I've tried a number of different services and they all came up short for one reason or another, but I can honestly say NordVPN is the best I've found, and having been a customer for well over a year now, I highly recommend you check them out. NordVPN also offers a free 30-day money-back guarantee, so start protecting your internet experience today with 75% off a 3-year plan by using code HardwareUnboxed at nordvpn.com/HardwareUnboxed. Link is in the video description. Okay, so just quickly, the Ryzen 9 3900X is a 12-core 24-thread processor with a massive 64MB L3 cache. It runs at a base frequency of 3.8 GHz with a boost frequency of 4.6 GHz. It costs $500 US, and that places it in direct competition with the Core i9 9900K. Then, as I just said, we also have the Ryzen 7 3700X, which costs $330 US, and AMD suggests it's taking on the more expensive 9900K with this part. Anyway, it has 8 cores, 16 threads with a 32MB L3 cache, and clocks anywhere from 3.6 GHz to 4.4 GHz. Both of these 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs come with the Wraith Prism RGB box cooler, and I'll be using that for the majority of our testing. This does mean Intel will have a slight performance advantage here, but please keep in mind the cost of the cooler will be factored into our value analysis for each processor. That said, I will provide some 3900X and 3700X performance figures using an all-in-one liquid cooler as well. The MSI X570 Creation was used for testing the 3900X and 3700X, while the Asus ROG Crosshair 7 Hero was used to test the 1st and 2nd gen Ryzen processors. All have been tested with DDR4 3200CL14 memory, but there will also be some memory scaling benchmarks included in the video, as AMD recommends using DDR4 3600CL16 memory for best results, so we will look into that. As for the 8th and 9th gen Intel Core processors, they were benchmarked on the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Ultra using the same DDR4 3200CL14 memory, but they were cooled using the Corsair Hydro Series H115i RGB Platinum 280mm all-in-one liquid cooler. Please note that the Intel CPUs are not TDP restricted, as that's not the typical out-of-the-box experience, so that means we're showing the absolute best case scenario for out-of-the-box performance. Finally, the graphics card of choice was the MSI Gaming X Trio GeForce RTX 2080 Ti. Okay, I think that covers pretty well everything. Let's get into the benchmark results, and maybe grab a drink and some snacks before we get started. Okay, so where better to start than Cinebench R20's multi-threaded benchmark, and oh boy, does the Ryzen 9 3900X look quite mighty here, scoring an incredible 7,086 points, making it 24% faster than the Threadripper 2920X, and that really is incredible. Moreover, it completely decimated the 9900K by a 45% margin. The Ryzen 7 3700X was equally impressive. The new 8-core part matched the 9900K, and this meant it was 22% faster than the 2700X and 30% faster than the more expensive 9700K. Needless to say, these new 3rd gen Ryzen parts are already looking like kings of productivity. Now, just have to say, this one is a rather big deal. Here the 3900X matched the single core performance of the 9900K, and that meant it was 19% faster than the 2700X. The 3700X also did very well, hitting 500 points, and that placed it roughly on par with the 9700K. So this is a massive performance improvement for Ryzen. Here we have some memory bandwidth figures, and this is sustained read-write performance. As I said earlier, all CPUs here are using DDR4 3200CL14 memory, but interestingly the 3rd gen processors are a little down on the 1st and 2nd gen, but there is a good reason for this, and I will cover that a bit later in the video when we're exploring IPC performance. For now, let's move on to check out a few application benchmarks. As you can see, the changes AMD made with the Zen 2 architecture have had a profound impact on WinRAR performance. The 3700X is unbelievably 84% faster than the 2700X, allowing it to comfortably beat the 8700K and almost match the Core i9 7900X. The 3900X also put on quite the show, though it was only 15% faster than the 3700X, and it couldn't quite match the 9900K. Still, overall a remarkable performance uplift here over the 2nd gen parts. Moving on to 7-zip, and first up we have the compression test, where traditionally Ryzen hasn't really done that well. For example, you can see how the 2700X is 14% slower than the 9900K. However, all that looks to have changed here with the 3rd iteration of Ryzen, as we see the 3700X easily brushing aside the 9900K by a 15% margin, basically matching the 10-core 7900X. Then we see the 3900X beating the 2920X by an 11% margin, and the 9900K by a whopping 45% margin. So yeah, king of productivity it looks like. I already said that, but damn, these productivity results are impressive. Then when it comes to decompression work, 3rd gen Ryzen still enjoys a handy performance advantage. Here the 3700X was 11% faster than the 9900K and a whopping 52% faster than the 9700K. Meanwhile, the 3900X was a little over 60% faster than the 9900K and even offered a 17% performance uplift over the Threadripper 2920X. Now, this result really gets me quite excited, if the previous ones haven't already, as I use Premiere on an almost daily basis, and I'm currently doing so with a Threadripper 2950X. Here we see the 3900X is 8% faster than the 2920X, so this means the 3950X will beat the 2950X quite comfortably when it's released in a few months' time. And with that, I can't even imagine what the 3rd gen Threadripper series will be able to deliver. Anyway, here the 3900X was 22% faster than the 9900K, and that's no small performance uplift. In fact, even the 3700X edged out the 9900K, making it 25% faster than the 9700K. And then what makes these results even more impressive is the fact that Premiere is a very pro Intel piece of software. So that is to say, it's quite biased towards Intel. AMD's shown the 3900X to be a little over 50% faster than the 9900K in DaVinci Resolve. And yeah, I know, I need to get a DaVinci project sorted out so I can start adding that to our benchmarks, and I promise I'll get that done soon. But anyway, the results in Premiere are still very, very impressive. Moving along, first up we have the older 1.0.8 version of the V-Ray benchmark, and I've included this because, well, I had all the data for the previous processors, and I thought, well, might as well just add the 3rd gen processors and show you how they compare. Anyway, using this older version, the 3900X took just 48 seconds to complete the workload, while the 3700X took just 68 seconds. This means although the 3700X was slightly slower than the 9900K, it was much faster than the 9700K. Meanwhile, the 3900X beat absolutely everything, including the 2920X. We also see very similar margins in the newest version of the V-Ray benchmark, though here the Core i7-7900X does manage to edge ahead of the 2920X. Despite that though, the 3900X easily conquered all, while the 3700X wasn't much slower than the 9900K. So another strong result for AMD. Similar margins are also seen when testing with Corona. The 3900X was 30% faster than the 9900K, while the 3700X was just 10% slower than the Core i9 processor. The 3700X was also 12% faster than the 2700X. Certainly not its most extreme performance uplift over the 2nd gen Ryzen part, but certainly decent all the same. The last application we're going to look at is Blender, and once again we see similar margins between the tested processors, though this time the 3700X is much closer to the 9900K than it is to the 2700X. While running the Blender Open Data benchmark, I also measured the entire system power draw, so let's check out those results before getting into the gaming benchmarks. Well, would you look at that? The 3700X consumed less power than the 2600X. Quite a bit less, and even less than the 8700K. In fact, it was comparable to the R5 2600 and 1600, along with the old quad-core 7700K. And just as remarkable was the 3900X, which was comparable to the 2700X and 7900X, making it worlds more efficient than the 9900K and 2920X. It's pretty crazy when you realize that the 3900X was 41% faster than the 9900K in Blender, and yet it reduced total system consumption by 8%. That really is a stellar result for AMD, and on that high note, I'm going to cautiously move into the gaming benchmarks. Right, so starting with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the new 3rd gen Ryzen processors are around 10% faster than the 2700X, which is quite a good result really, but it's not good enough to beat the 9900K, at least when looking at the average frame rate. Despite similar frame time performance, the 9900K was 4% faster on average at 1080p with an RTX 2080 Ti. I know this is really close enough to call a tie, so let's see what happens at 1440p. Oddly, we don't see a coming together of the results at 1440p like you would expect, but rather the 9900K is now 6% faster than the 3900X, and even more bizarre is the fact that the 2920X is now matching the 3900X. Though to be fair, it wasn't too far behind at 1080p, so perhaps all that extra memory bandwidth is coming in handy at 1440p. Then we see that the 9700K was also 6% faster than the 3700X. Again, not a big margin, but I was hoping to see less of a gap at 1440p. Right, so these results are a little bit disappointing. Well, maybe that's a bit too harsh. After all, the 3rd gen Ryzen parts were both 11% faster than the 2700X, and that is another decent performance gain. The problem is, they're both well down on the 9900K's average and 1% low performance. The 9900K was 8% faster on average and 13% faster when looking at the 1% low result. Again, certainly not a massive margin, but given the slides that we'd seen from AMD, I have to admit I was hoping for more. Still, it is worth noting that at 1440p, the 9900K was just 4% faster than the 3900X, and generally anything within a 5% margin I declare as a draw. So at least under these more typical gaming conditions, there's almost nothing in it. But that still doesn't change the fact that the 9900K is the superior gamer, or at least it is for today's games. Now, here's our biggest deficit yet. This time the 9900K was 17% faster than the 3900X when comparing the average frame rate, and 20% faster for the 1% low result. The 3700X did do better relative to the 9700K, but again, gaming still looks to be advantage Intel. Bumping the resolution up to 1440p does reduce the margins quite heavily, and now the 9900K was just 8% faster for the average frame rate, and this is certainly a more realistic resolution for an RTX 2080 Ti. I have to admit, I was hoping these 3rd gen Ryzen processors would be a little more punchy in the Division 2, but don't get me wrong, the gameplay was still incredibly smooth, but even so, the 9900K was still 11% faster than the 13900X. But with similar 1% low performance, the Ryzen processors really were smooth operators. Then as we move to 1440p, as you'd probably expect in this game, we're now entirely GPU bound with these higher end CPUs, and this allowed the 9900K, 9700K, 3700X and 3900X to all deliver identical performance. Next up we have Far Cry New Dawn, and this title, along with previous installments in this series, have always been troublesome for AMD Ryzen processors. Here we see the 2700X allowing for just 98 FPS on average, and that made the 9900K 26% faster. The new 3rd gen Ryzen parts don't completely solve this issue, but they do dramatically push things in the right direction for AMD. And as a result, we see that the 9900K is now just 10% faster than both the 3900X and 3700X. Then at 1440p, the margin is reduced even further, as you'd probably expect, and now it's just the 1% low results that noticeably favour the Intel 8-core processors. The deficit seen in Far Cry New Dawn was a little disappointing, and the same can be said when discussing the World War Z results. In fact, this is by far the most disappointing result we've seen, and that's because the 3rd gen Ryzen processors are no faster than the 2700X. This means the 9900K was 18% faster than the 3900X, and the 9700K was 21% faster than the 3700X. So whatever it is that past Ryzen processors don't like about World War Z, this latest generation isn't able to address. Even at the more GPU limited 1440p, the 9900K was still able to beat the 3900X by a 9% margin. So again, not an ideal result for AMD. Moving on, we have some Rage 2 results, and here the 3900X and 3700X do perform very well, offering slightly better 1% low performance than the 2700X, which puts them on par with the 8700K. Having said all that though, we do see that the 9900K and 9700K offer slightly better 1% low performance, around 7% better. Not really a big deal here, and as you might expect, the gaming experience was virtually identical. Then at 1440p, we're entirely GPU bound with these higher end CPUs. From the 3700X up, we're able to get the most out of the RTX 2080 Ti. Hitman 2 is another one of those titles that's never been that friendly with AMD Ryzen processors, and we see that it's still an issue for the 3rd gen parts. Here the 9900K beat the 3900X by a 15% margin, though that's nothing like the 27% margin it beats the 2700X by, so there is that. Once again, the margins at 1440p are heavily reduced, and now the 9900K is just 5% faster than the 3900X. The 3700X was still 9% faster than the 2700X, so the 3rd gen Ryzen series have really made a good step forward here when it comes to gaming. Finally, the last game that we're going to look at is Total War 3 Kingdoms, and this is a solid result for AMD. The 3700X was able to improve the 1% low performance of the 2700X by an 8% margin, making it just 1% slower than the 9900K and 5% slower than the 9700K, which actually does a little bit better in this title without hyperthreading. Then at 1440p, we're once again almost entirely GPU bound, leaving just a frame or two in it at the most. So I think that's a pretty good spot to wrap up the gaming benchmarks, and I think we'll move on to take a quick look at some memory scaling, or at least how DDR4 3200 and 3600 compare. DDR4 3600 is the fastest memory spec AMD recommends using with 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs, as higher clocked memory will actually reduce performance, at least when clocked higher than 3733, as this changes the Infinity Fabric to a 2-to-1 mode rather than a 1-to-1 mode. Basically, 2-to-1 sees the Infinity Fabric clocked at a quarter of the memory speed, while 1-to-1 is half. Since AMD did recommend DDR4 3600 memory for optimal performance and provided reviewers with a CL16 kit, I thought I'd better test it out, just to make sure we're not hampering performance by using the CL14 3200 kit. The good news is we're not. Here you'll see virtually identical performance in Corona, WinRAR, Far Cry New Dawn, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and World War Z. Unfortunately, due to time, I didn't get a whole lot of memory testing done, but this is something I will follow up with, providing a much more detailed video in the near future. At the request of many of our Patreon members, I also took a quick look at chipset performance, comparing B450 to X570 using the MSI B450 Tomahawk and X570 Creation. I didn't include an X470 board, again due to time, and given we know B450 and X470 boards deliver the same performance, you should be able to fill in the gaps pretty easily there. Looking at the Cinebench scores, there appears to be a slight performance advantage in favour of the X570 board, but we're only talking a 1% difference, which is within the margin of error, though the results did always favour the X570 board when taking an average of 3 runs. Enabling PBO plus Auto OC in the Ryzen Master, we again see similar performance on the X570 and B450 boards. And as claimed by AMD, the PBO feature of the 3rd gen Ryzen processors can be enabled on all motherboards that support these processors. And just lastly, a quick look at gaming performance with World War Z, and again, very similar performance on both boards. I will have a much more in-depth video soon looking at B350 and X370 motherboards, but given the time I had allocated for this review, we're going to have to settle with the B450 versus X570 comparison. Moving on, we have some IPC testing, and for this I've clocked the 9900K, 3700X, 2700X and 1700X at 4 GHz using the same DDR4 3200 CL14 memory. The results, I have to say, are quite staggering. Whereas clock for clock, the 2700X is 4% slower than the 9900K, the 3700X is 13% faster. I don't really know what to say about that. It's a pretty amazing result. So I guess there you have it. AMD certainly weren't stretching the truth when they claimed a 15% improvement in IPC over 2nd gen Ryzen. Here we're seeing an 18% improvement. Interestingly though, we do only see an 11% boost in single core performance, but even so that's still a massive generational jump, and that means the 3700X was still 7% faster than the 9900K when matched clock for clock. Despite the mind-blowing Cinebench results, the 9900K is still able to show these young, feisty Ryzen processors who's boss when it comes to gaming. Clock for clock, the 9900K was still 10% faster than the 3700X. However, perhaps more shocking is the fact that in this particular title, the 3700X was just 2% faster than the 2700X. I guess this explains why the results in this particular title and others such as Far Cry New Dawn were a little more disappointing than we were hoping for. Still, we do see quite a different story when testing with Battlefield 5, at least when comparing the 2nd and 3rd gen Ryzen processors. Here the 3700X provided an 8% performance boost over the 2700X when both were locked at the same 4 GHz frequency. Despite that though, the 9900K was still 7% faster than the 3700X. So why is that? Well, once again, a big part of the issue is core-to-core latency. But the good news is AMD's made massive strides forward in this area, taking core-to-core latency from around 81 nanoseconds down to just 56 nanoseconds, and that's a 30% reduction in latency. This also means core-to-core communication is just 11% slower when compared to the 9900K, and that's a big part of why we're seeing 3rd gen Ryzen close in on the 9900K's gaming performance, but also why it's still not quite there yet. Also, just lastly, something that seemed a bit odd at first when I discovered it is the memory write performance of 3rd gen Ryzen. It's significantly down on the 1st and 2nd gen parts. AMD's made a compromise here, as client workloads do very little writing, so rather than use this space to improve something that isn't really going to boost performance overall, they've invested this silicon real estate in more beneficial ways to achieve tangible performance gains. So whereas the core complex die to IO die link for reading memory is 32 bytes wide, it's only 16 bytes wide for writing, and this is why the peak write bandwidth is effectively cut in half. Now, time for the overclocking results, and again, due to limited time, I didn't do as much testing here as I would have liked. But it seems pretty clear that just like the first and second gen Ryzen CPUs, there's very little overclocking headroom to speak of with these third gen Ryzen processors. And this really isn't that surprising. Both AMD and Intel are locked in a fierce battle which sees both trying to extract the maximum amount of performance they can from these high-end CPUs. At best, I was able to boost the 3900X's multi-core score by 4%, while the 3700X saw a 6% increase. However, as was the case with second gen Ryzen, the simple multiplier OC method that I used for the 4.3 GHz all-core overclock is not really the method you want to be using. Here we see when looking at the single core results, it does reduce performance, leaving PBO overclocking as the most effective method overall. Still, I feel that most won't bother overclocking to extract that extra 4 to 6% performance, and from what I've heard from other reviewers, 4.3 GHz seems to be one of the better overclocks, at least for the 3900X. On an even more disappointing note, I somehow managed to end the life of my 3900X. There's really no delicate way to say it. At this stage of the review, yeah, I managed to kill my Ryzen 9 3900X processor. I'm not sure exactly what settings were applied. I know I hadn't got into manually adjusting the voltage yet. I was letting the board handle it. I'm not going to specify which board it was because these were very early BIOSes that, yeah, well, they were review BIOSes that hadn't been fully validated. Anyway, I believe I was, well, after testing 4.3 GHz, I decided to, again, leave the voltage on auto and then increase the LLC to see if I could, well, see what impact that had on temperatures and stuff like that. I was just messing around. It was very, very late at night. I wasn't fully paying attention to what I was doing, but I certainly never expected to kill the processor. In all my years, never ever run into a problem like this. Anyway, booted up into Windows. I wasn't really voltage monitoring, so maybe my bad. Anyway, I only ran a Cinebench 20 pass, a multi-core pass, which doesn't run for a particularly long time. Anyway, it crashed about halfway through, reset the system, and sadly, it never booted up again. The CPU now gets stuck at code 07, which is AP initialization after microcode. I tried another completely different X570 board from a different brand, so yeah, completely different board, and I got the exact same postcode error. Then after trying the B450 Tomahawk, once that was flashed up and working with the 3700X, I tried the 3900X, and yeah, sadly, it was declared completely dead at that point. Did not boot up at all. AMD assures me that no other reviewers have managed to kill their 3900X, so I guess I'm just special or unlucky. I'll let you guys pick on that one. AMD has sent me a replacement, but unfortunately it hasn't arrived in time for me to update any of the testing that I didn't get done, obviously, in this review. That'll be arriving, well, tomorrow, so Monday, and then I can get on with a few more tests I want to do, like try the 3900X on B450 motherboards, add it to our IPC testing so we can see how two chiplets impact the results there. But anyway, that's what happened, so extremely unfortunate. In all my years, never ever had this problem, but obviously CPUs do have a defective rate, as small as it is, so maybe it wasn't anything to do with the early BIOSes, it was just a bad chip. Unfortunately, the death of my 3900X also means I don't have any temperature data at all, so for this we're just going to have to settle for what I've been able to collect with the 3700X. Basically, with the Wraith Prism RGB box cooler, you can get pretty close to extracting maximum performance out of the 3700X, though it does get a little toasty, but on the bright side, the cooler is very quiet, so 87 degrees for the overclock is very respectable. Of course, if you are going to overclock, I recommend an aftermarket cooler. You certainly don't need something as expensive as the Corsair Hydro Series H115i, but that's what I had available for testing. And as you can see, after an hour-long Blender stress test, the 3700X peaked at just 73 degrees. It's a shame I don't have the 3900X results, but I suspect with the box cooler, it runs at around 80 degrees stock under heavy load. Of course, all the results for the 3900X seen in this video were recorded with the box cooler, as I noted earlier. Okay, so we've now seen how these new 3rd gen Ryzen processors perform. It's time to work out if you should actually buy them, and what do they offer in terms of value. So let's move on to do that. Looking at the current asking prices, you're paying quite a premium for these new CPUs when compared to the second gen parts, but that's really hardly surprising. When compared to the Intel competition, purely for gaming, the 3700X is on par with the 9700K and 8700K in terms of value. The 3900X doesn't stack up quite as well here, and this means the 9900K is actually quite a bit better in terms of value. Or is it? While the 3900X comes with a box cooler, none of the Intel K SKU parts do. So let's add in the cost of a good air cooler and then recalculate the cost per frame. When I asked on Twitter, most of you seemed to agree that the Be Quiet Dark Rock 4 for $75 was a reasonable pairing for the 9900K and 9700K, so I've added that to the budget for the K processors. Factoring in the cooler means the 3900X is now better value than the 9900K, and the 3700X is very similar to the Core i5 9600K. Motherboard costs are much the same really, so it's just the cooler that those considering Intel need to account for. As for AMD's second and first gen Ryzen processors, well, they're bloody cheap these days, so it makes it hard to compare them with these new third gen Ryzen parts. Still, the 3700X costs just 14% more per frame than the 2700X, and given the massive power savings and improvement in single and lightly threaded workloads, I think it's well worth that premium. So it'll be interesting to see how the Ryzen 5 3600 stacks up against the R5 2600 and 1600 when I test it in a few days' time. Moving on from gaming, let's take a quick look at a few applications, starting with Blender. On this scatter graph, you ideally want to be as low as possible and as far to the right as possible. As you can see, the 3700X is not only much lower on the graph than the 9700K, but it's also much further to the right, indicating significantly better price to performance. The 3900X is also significantly lower than the 9900K, but much more to the right as it's significantly more affordable and much faster. We see a similar story in Premiere. The competing AMD processors are all situated lower on the graph and further to the right, making them not just more affordable, but also faster. Okay, so despite the fact that I've already blurted out over 4,000 words and we're over 50 graphs deep into this review, I feel like there is a lot more that I would like to cover, and I guess that's partly because my 3900X testing was cut so short. Nevertheless, we have covered all the essentials in this review, and you should now have a pretty good idea of how the Ryzen 9 3900X and Ryzen 7 3700X compare to the current generation Intel CPUs. I also have a very, very nice looking range of X570 motherboards that I've been checking out over the past week, but I'll save getting into all those until a little bit later on. For now, just enjoy.
Alongside the R9 3900X and R7 3700X that we're also reviewing, AMD launched its R5 3600 today to the public. We got a production sample of one of the R5 3600 CPUs through a third party, and after seeing its performance, we wanted to focus first on this one for our initial Ryzen 3000 review. This CPU is supposed to be a $200 part. We've been recommending AMD's R5 CPU